Thank you, thank you, Kim. Thank you, Chantel. Thank you, David, for inviting me. Thank you all for being here. My paper was supposed to be read in the afternoon, but because Sinfree isn't here, I was moved to the now. And actually, it turns out that I think that my paper fits here extremely well. So we'll see if you all agree with that. During the course of my anthropological career until now, I have worked in what I think most people might rather unproblematically agree are some pretty tough places. I've spent a total of almost 3 years in the middle of a mosquito-infested rainforest in Papua New Guinea, which is a country where the law and order situation is so bad that it consistently earns one of the top spots on that great list, the 10 most dangerous countries in the world. It usually comes right after alluring Afghanistan, charming Chechnya, and swashbuckling Somalia. I've also spent a year in a favela in Brazil working with transgendered prostitutes who are called travestis in local parlance. I've lived with them in a house where crack cocaine was sold and smoked by my neighbors, and where people actually had to barricade their doors at night to try to keep hordes of frisky, fat rats from flowing into their rooms. Now, despite living in those rather outré places under conditions that I think that most people would probably consider to be, or would agree with me, are rather difficult, I want to set the stage for my talk today by confessing to you that the single most terrifying fieldwork experience that I ever had occurred not in the jungles of Papua New Guinea or in a Brazilian favela. It occurred in Denmark, just outside the lovely town of Roskilde, only a few months ago. I was in Denmark because I was conducting fieldwork for my most recent research, which is a study of disability and sexuality. Denmark is very interesting in this context because there, the sexuality of people with severe physical and intellectual impairments is acknowledged, discussed, and facilitated. Now, I wanted to discover what it means in practice to facilitate the sexuality of people with disabilities, so I spent 6 months last year doing field work. I lived in group homes, and I interviewed people with severe intellectual and physical impairments, and I also interviewed people who work with them and care for them. Before I began fieldwork in Denmark, I like to joke with my friends that not only would I have to start understanding Danish, which is a language that has no vowels. It can be spoken without anyone moving their lips, and it sounds as though people are expectorating, not speaking. So just to give you a quick example, the word for what is a word that is spelled V-A-D. It is pronounced the. Now, not only would I have to understand this odd-sounding language, I would have to understand this odd-sounding language spoken by people with severe speech impediments. The biggest difficulty that my friends and I would laugh about is the pragmatic principle that Paul Grice somehow mysteriously overlooked, but that we might call in his honor the Maxim of Three, or why not, the Thrice Maxim. And this is the principle that dictates that the maximum number of times that you can ask what if you don't understand something is 3. Someone says something that you don't understand. Without any problem, you can say in whatever language you happen to be trying to be speaking, you can say the local version of sorry. They will repeat what they just said. You still don't get it. What? You can say again with no worries. Your interlocutor will politely say whatever it is that they said one more time. Wait, sorry, I still didn't get that. What did you say? You can say again, but you know that that is your last shot. Usually, interlocutors will good-naturedly repeat their question or request or order or jocular comment. They'll repeat it one more time in response to the third time you ask what. But if you still don't get it after that third repetition, then you are truly screwed. Because to admit that you still don't understand and to ask the speaker to repeat themselves one more time, well, a fourth question will not only grind the interaction to a complete standstill, it will also classify you as a dullard with the conversational competence of a refrigerator. Before arriving in Denmark, I repressed all of that. And so now I want you to imagine a film that cuts from me and my friends laughing like ignorant hyenas about what linguistic difficulties my fieldwork might entail to the following scene. It's 2 weeks after I've moved to Denmark, and 12 days after I have reached the unanticipated, irrevocable, and thoroughly horrifying conclusion that I barely understand a word that anybody says to me in Danish. Now, I have lived in Sweden for most of my adult life, and I had acquired the Swedish fantasy that one understands Danish if you understand Swedish, and that the way to speak Danish is to speak Swedish as though you have a sharp pin stuck through your tongue. Now, like any Swede who actually tries to understand Danish without any subtitles, I was stunned that I could understand so little. Through various contexts and still very much in the fog of panic that congealed around my entire body as soon as any Dane opened their mouth in my general direction, I get invited to a group home for people with disabilities to meet the people who live there. I somehow managed to travel to the place, with which ethical considerations prevent me from naming, but which has a name like Røøre or Inghav. I arrive at this group home and I'm met at the front door by the woman who had arranged the visit, who I'll call Lone, and who works as a seksualvejleder, a sex advisor at this group home. Now, I have spoken to Lone on the phone, but I only understood about 10% of what she told me. So even though I suspect that Lone has probably explained everything to me in advance, I have no idea what kind of group home this is. I have no idea what kind of people live there. I have no idea how many of them there are, and I have no idea how this meeting will proceed. Now, I arrived late because I'd gotten off at the wrong bus stop, and so as soon as I get to the front door, Lone, who has been waiting for me, greets me and says something that I don't quite catch. She then hurries me along to the corridor towards a door which she flings open. And there, inside the room that Lone directs me to enter, is my worst, most terrifying, most chilling and spine-tingling nightmare. 10 people, all of them in wheelchairs, and all of them clearly severely disabled with cerebral palsy, are sitting around a table looking at me expectantly, waiting for me to say something, and even worse, waiting for me to understand what they are going to say to me in Danish with speech impediments. I looked around the room, and the Maxim of Three shot into my head like a bullet, and all I could think of was, Don, you are fucked. And so I had to cope. I had to deal. And you know what? I did. For the next 2 hours, the young women and men around the table, all of whom lived in this group home and had been meeting for several years, once a week on Thursdays to talk about sexuality, for the next 2 hours, they talked with me about their relationships, their dreams, their sexual awakenings, their sexual experiences, and many other things. And I listened. I understood what I could. I pretended to understand a lot more. I made a few lame jokes that some of them actually chuckled at. And by the end of the 2 hours, when it was time for their lunch break, I left the group home feeling dazed, relieved, enlightened, chastened, happy, and most of all in dire need of a gin and tonic the size of the Colosseum. Now, I wanted to share that episode with you today because the topic of my talk is the benefits of working in a language you don't know. I thought of this topic as a direct result of the incident that I've just described to you. After I left the group home on the bus back to Copenhagen, I thought to myself in a kind of incredulous stupor, I thought, why in the world are you putting yourself through this again? I thought about how I'd gone to Papua New Guinea with no knowledge of Tok Pisin, which is the most widely spoken national language, and without even the slightest clue about the local vernacular language that was spoken in the village that I ended up working in. This is a Papuan language that had never been documented by anybody until I just did it myself recently in a grammar that's going to be published next year. And I thought about how I went to Brazil without a word of Portuguese, brazenly assuming that I'd learn the language once I got there, and steadfastly repressing the thought that my lack of Portuguese meant that I would spend the first several months of my fieldwork appearing to everyone as only slightly more sentient than a potted plant. And now, after those two experiences, which I've always readily admitted to anyone who would listen, were the cause of untold hours of pain, stress, and horror, why in the world was I doing this again? Why was I plunging headfirst into a field site where I didn't know the goddamn language? Now, I wouldn't waste your time asking that question if I thought it was only a therapeutic query that should, pertain to my personal experiences, that should be something that I should talk about with my therapist. I don't think only that. On the contrary, I want to propose that working in a language that one doesn't know has a number of significant benefits that I think that we, as academics who work with language, need to be more conscious of and more protective of. So what are the benefits of working in a language one doesn't know? I think there may be many more than I can think of or have experienced. For example, one benefit might be that without verbal language, one might become better attuned to nonverbal dimensions of language. And one might be more sensitized to and observant of what people do rather than what people say. Now, this might be true for some people, but unfortunately it doesn't work for me. When I'm learning a language, I'm always on sort of red alert. I'm usually far too much on alert to notice the details of how people walk or how they gesture or reveal their innermost secrets. My biggest anxiety is that someone to whom I've been listening will pose the worst possible question that a language learner can receive, namely, do you understand? In the beginning months of learning a language in situ, the honest answer to that usually well-meaning question would be a simple no. But to admit that one has not been following a conversation that one has been actively participating in by nodding vigorously and affirmatively and mouthing the local equivalent of yes, to admit that all of those affirmations were just pragmatic, phatic tokens that really meant, I actually have no idea at all what you're talking about, but please continue, because as long as you're talking, I don't have to. And if you keep up the flow, maybe at some point I'll hopefully recognize a word or phrase that will allow me to at least make a ballpark guess about what this conversation might possibly be about. To admit that would be to make the speaker realize that they really might as well have been talking to a refrigerator. So, in response to that demonic question, do you understand or are you understanding? ¿Está entendiendo? I will almost always say yes, but I do so in constant anxiety that my interlocutor will then lean forward, narrow his or her eyes into little menacing slits, and ask in what I undoubtedly would hear as a Nazi accent, no matter what language was being spoken, Welsen? Maybe you can tell me, what exactly were we speaking about? Now, as for the benefits of working in a language you don't know, I can propose at least three. First, incompetence in a language that one is working in promotes dependency. One needs a lot of help. And one is therefore forced to seek out that help in many ways. One of the ways that I sought out help to learn the two languages that I learned in Papua New Guinea and Portuguese in Brazil was through transcription. I have always tape recorded when I have done field work, and this has never been the slightest problem. In Brazil, for example, I announced to the travestis with whom I lived that I needed to record their conversations, partly because it was the only way I was ever going to understand anything that they were talking about. They didn't mind, so I recorded away, and I paid a travesti named Kayla Simpson to sit with me and to transcribe the tapes that I had made. So Kayla and I sat together with a pair of earphones each, and I asked Kayla to tell me what was being said on the tape. This is actually one of the best language learning methods that I have ever encountered. I think it's second only to the famous pillow talk method, which requires that one acquire a lover who only speaks the target language. And doing this with Kayla, I progressed very quickly from barely understanding anything to understanding quite a lot. This condition of dependency implies a condition of harmlessness. And this is the second benefit that working in a language that one doesn't know that I can identify. And again, let me exemplify once again with my work in Brazil. Brazilian travestis are one of the country's most marginalized and harassed groups. They're understandably suspicious of strangers who come snooping around asking questions about their lives, and they answer those questions with completely reasonable levels of caution and lies. Now, when I first started visiting travestis in order to ingratiate myself with them, I was able to say almost nothing to them because my Portuguese was pretty much non-existent. I spent a lot of time agonizing over this, thinking about how much more quickly and effectively a fluent Portuguese speaker would be able to do the study that I had set out to do. But in the end, I actually came to the conclusion that my initial linguistic incompetence proved to be an advantage that greatly facilitated the kind of contact with travestis that I came to develop. I don't have any doubt whatsoever that my smiling, nodding, uncomprehending presence on their doorstep and in their rooms was stressful for travestis during the first few months of my stay. It was certainly very stressful for me. But my initial linguistic incompetence made it possible for me to pass through an extended period of relatively wordless incorporation into their day-to-day lives. Travestis who attempted to focus on or entertain me when I was in their company quickly realized that I had no idea what they were saying to me, so they got bored and turned their attention to one another. Or else they made fun of me. Something that Kayla told me only a few years ago, like 10 years after the fact, was that travestis loved to laugh at me during the first few months of my fieldwork with them. A favorite game they all liked to play was to turn to me, point to a travesti standing away on the street, and ask me, "Oh, Tom, a gente acha que aquela bicha ali é feia. Você não acha que ela é muito feia?" And my response, Kayla told me, would always be a predictable smiling, nodding, bobbing, yeah. And the travestis loved this because what they had just asked me, what they had just said to me was, "Dawn, we think that travesti standing over there is really ugly. Don't you think she's ugly?" And I'm like, yeah. Now, I had no idea that I was the butt of all of these jokes, but being seen as a fool was clearly something that worked in my favor. By the time I was able to understand and contribute to the conversations and the gossip, I was already established as a fixed, agreeable, non-condemnatory, and non-threatening presence in their lives. The third, obviously related benefit of working in a language one doesn't know is that it makes one very vulnerable. It makes one the target of jokes, insults, indignities, and numerous, frequent, soul-draining humiliations. In a tangible way, I think it makes one handicapped. And over the past few months, I've been reflecting on how my current research with severely impaired adults is, in a sense, a logical extension of my previous research. I am studying people who, in life, embody a much more profound version of the social position that I, partly through my linguistic incompetence, temporarily inhabit in all of the places that I've done fieldwork. And that incompetence and the vulnerability that it materializes has helped to strengthen, I think, my sense of empathy and affinity that I have with people with disabilities. Now, the thing I'd ask you to note is that all three of the benefits that I've mentioned are at the same time epistemological, in the sense that they pertain to understanding and organization of knowledge. They're methodological, in that they involve ways of gathering data. And they are also ontological in that they're fundamentally constitutive of the field worker's being in the field. But in addition to this, they're also ethical in the sense that they promote empathy and they structure both how I engage with others and how others engage with me. Now, if we wanted to, it seems to me that it would be relatively easy to construct an erudite case for the benefits of working in a language that one doesn't know. One could, for example, turn to the ethical theories of philosophers like Emmanuel Levinas, Hannah Arendt, Adriana Cavalheiro, Judith Butler, and why not Michael Bakhtin as well, who argue in different ways that the self exists only because it is exposed, susceptible, and vulnerable, and that furthermore, and importantly, responsibility emerges as a consequence of being subjected to the address of the other. because it is that address that inaugurates our sense of ourselves as separate from and yet subject to the demands of the other. So in terms of the topic of my talk, this means that vulnerability and susceptibility, like that is created by working in a language one doesn't know, this is a condition that promotes not only a heightened sense of responsiveness to others, but also a heightened sense of responsibility that we have to those with whom we are working in research. Now, I don't really want to get all philosophical with this, but I mention these arguments, these ethical arguments, because I think it's important to know that we can, if we want to, bring out our big philosophical guns to defend the practice of working in a language one doesn't know. If philosophical arguments can help us strategically to resist the trends that I'm about to discuss, then I say let's drag Levinas and Arendt and anyone else we can think of kicking and screaming into that fray. So if you agree with me that there's something important and perhaps even precious to be gained by recklessly plunging into a field site with no language skills other than a hopeful ear and an eager, if clumsy, tongue, then allow me to outline some of the reasons why I think this kind of exuberant project is increasingly at risk. The kind of fieldwork that I've been discussing today is at risk because of at least three processes that have different histories and configurations. The first is the rise, during the past 30 years, of identity politics. Even if we acknowledge the immense political advances of identity politics, which I'm sure I don't have to rehearse to anyone here, I also think that we might be able to agree that identity politics has some problems. The dimension of identity politics that is most relevant to my topic is the insistence that everyone has, or should have, their own voice, and that it is therefore somehow an act of aggression to speak for someone else. And this brings me to the second phenomenon I want to mention, and that is post-colonial and critical theory. Now, post-colonial and critical theory, and here I'm thinking of everyone from Said and Foucault onwards, has taught us that the act of producing knowledge about the other is in itself a mode of domination. Now, the productivity of this insight has been profound and paradigm-changing. But one perhaps unintended consequence of the links between knowledge and power that we've all been taught and that we now all teach our students is that we've engineered an increased squeamishness about studying the other. If to produce knowledge about the other is to dominate that other, then how can any politically aware scholar justify studying a group other than his or her own group, especially a group that is disempowered or oppressed in the global world order? One place that I have seen the consequences of that squeamishness, at least in the United States, is in student applications to graduate programs. Over the years that I've been reading through hundreds of those applications, I've noted what, in my view, is a disturbing trend. Students, even the ones that apply to write a PhD thesis in anthropology, my discipline, increasingly only want to study themselves. So white, gay, middle-class Americans want to study other white, gay, middle-class Americans. Latinos from working-class backgrounds want to study other Latinos from working-class backgrounds. African Americans want to study African Americans. Korean adoptees want to study Korean adoptees, and so on. I can count on the fingers of one hand the times in all the years that I've been reading grad school applications, the times that I have ever seen an application from a self-identified Latino who wanted to study something like child socialization in India, or a self-identified trans person who wanted to study something like farming practices in Burkina Faso. Now, call me old-fashioned, but I believe that a graduate education should be an opportunity to confront profound difference, not luxuriate in reassuring sameness. I firmly believe that a graduate education should challenge students' identities, not comfort them and legitimate them. And so I'm distressed that we, with the identity politics and our critical theories, seem to have produced a generation of students so convinced that their identities are so infinitely interesting and so afraid to be accused of speaking for someone else that it sometimes seems that they see graduate school education more as an extended therapy session than they see it as an opportunity to learn about people who they otherwise probably never will encounter in any meaningful way. The third dimension that's important to consider in thinking about all this is, of course, university politics, especially the corporatization of universities. And this making a university into a corporation denotes the ways that institutions of higher education are increasingly being restructured on a business or a corporate model. So universities are no longer public institutions. They're supposed to be self-financing or even profit-generating enterprises. This profit can be generated by downsizing, that is, abolishing unfashionable departments like Latin, or fusing together small departments into what are usually billed as trans or cross-disciplinary centers, but which really, if the university administration were honest, would be called the etc. departments. That is to say, the departments that the university has created to save money out of all of the disciplines that it has decided are small, unimportant, unprofitable, and therefore pointless. Now, the corporatization of universities has a direct impact on language and education, partly because we see time and time again that language and other humanities departments are some of the first to go when the downsizing kicks in. And in addition to the disappearance of languages from university curricula, the demand that a student finish their PhD in 4 or 5 years means that it's almost impossible to spend much time using one's time as a graduate student learning a foreign language in any meaningful way, especially, of course, a foreign language that is not Western European, that is not well documented, or, God forbid, that is completely undocumented, like the Papuan language that I learned. So what I'm saying is that the convergence of identity politics, some of the consequences of post-colonial and critical theory, and the corporatization of the university means that students and professional academics are both losing the incentive and the possibility of learning languages that we don't already know. And this is not a trivial loss. My point is that it represents a potentially significant impoverishment of the disciplines in which we work. So the suggestion that I'd like to leave you all with, therefore, is that we first of all acknowledge that it's not necessarily a bad thing to work in a language one doesn't know. It's foolhardy, there's no doubt about that, and it results in much pain, stress, suffering, and premature aging. But it's worthwhile, and the knowledge that ultimately gets produced by someone who doesn't start out knowing a language of the people that he or she works with will not necessarily be weaker or more superficial than the knowledge produced by fluent speakers of that language. Who knows? The knowledge produced might even end up being just as original, or who knows, again, maybe even more original than that produced by fluent speakers. We need to be more aware and respectful of the fact that linguistic incompetence doesn't just present problems. It also presents a range of possibilities. The relations of dependency, helplessness, and vulnerability that come with incompetence have important epistemological, methodological, ontological, and ethical benefits that should be explored and embraced, not discouraged or disavowed. And to the extent that one accepts any of this, practical consequences follow. Students who want to explore the possibility of working with strange languages that will take them a long time to learn should be supported rather than dissuaded. Accommodation should actively be sought and fought for in the form of scholarships or extensions on doctoral stipends that will allow students the extra time they need to learn foreign, exotic, hard-to-learn tongues. University departments that teach small languages should be supported, and all attempts to abolish them or fuse them into some kind of dysfunctional Frankenstein's monsters should be actively resisted. When reviewing research applications, the fact that a researcher isn't a fluent speaker of a language should be given sympathetic consideration. It should not be disqualifying, and it should not be just dismissed and punished. And established researchers should be encouraged, for example, by being given the opportunity to take decent research leave, to embark on new projects involving new languages and not just spend their entire career composing variations of what they wrote in their PhD thesis. Now, telling all of you here today that knowing a language is important is, of course, preaching to the choir. You all already know that. But what some of you may not have considered is that not knowing a language can also be important. It can be productive, rewarding, worthwhile, and valuable in the ways that I've outlined here today. Now, even though I have no doubt that the stress of being thrust into situations like the ones I described to you at the beginning of my talk, I have no doubt that that's all shortened my life by many years. I don't really care, and I would do it all again. In fact, even as I begin to write up my analysis of sexuality and disability in Denmark, I'm already beginning to ponder new possible field sites. And the fact that I don't know the language of some of the places I'm considering is not a drawback. I see it as a bonus, an added extra attraction. Right now, Japan, for example, is looking really, really interesting. Thank you.